The air on that grey November morning in 1982 hung thick with the ghosts of failure. It smelled of damp earth, diesel fuel, and the metallic tang of desperation. A crowd of farmers, their faces etched with the same worry lines that creased their land, stood in a silent semicircle around the centerpiece of Richard Peterson's farm auction. It wasn't a prize-winning bull or a parcel of prime bottomland. It was a machine, a monster. A Steiger Panther III, its lime-green paint faded and peeling, its 8 massive tires sunk halfway to the rims in mud. One of the hydraulic lines for the articulated steering had burst, a black, oily wound weeping onto the frozen ground. The big Cummins V903 engine was silent, a cold heart in a colossal corpse. This tractor, which only 3 years ago had been the talk of the county, the symbol of progress, of farming in the modern age, was now just another item on the auctioneer's block, a monument to debt. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands stuffed deep in the pockets of my worn Carhartt jacket. My name is Frank Miller. My own farm was 5 miles down the road, a modest operation my father had started with a Farmall M and a prayer after the war. I wasn't here to bid. I was here to watch, to learn. A man can learn more at an auction than he can in a year's worth of coffee shop talk. You see what holds its value, what breaks a man's spirit, and what the bank finally comes to collect. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill who could sell a screen door to a submarine, was trying to work his magic. "All right, gentlemen, here she is, the big cat herself. Sure, she needs a little TLC, a little hose work, but you all know what this machine is capable of. Power. Pure, unadulterated American power. Who'll start the bidding for me at $20,000? $20,000 to own the biggest tractor in the county." Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the lane. 20,000 was a joke. Everyone knew Peterson had paid over 100,000 for it back in '79, with money borrowed when interest rates were still in the single digits. Now, with corn at $2 a bushel and the prime rate hovering near 15%, that Steiger wasn't a tool, it was an anchor, dragging him straight to the bottom. Richard Peterson himself stood off to the side, leaning against the fender of his new Ford pickup. The one thing the bank hadn't taken yet. He wore a clean seed corn cap and a bitter sneer, trying to project an image of a man merely inconvenienced by circumstance. He caught my eye and sauntered over, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. "Well, well, if it isn't Frank Miller," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Come to pick over the bones, have you? Looking for a bargain?" "Just watching, Rich," I said quietly. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humor. "Yeah, I'll bet. Probably hoping to pick this thing up for scrap price. You could probably pull it home with that old 40-20 of yours, if you hitch him up just right." He gestured vaguely toward the road where my John Deere 40-20 sat, its faded green paint and narrow front axle a stark contrast to the dead giant before us. It was a 1968 model, an open station, no cab, no radio, no air conditioning. And it was paid for. Every last bolt. "My 40-20 runs," I said, my voice even. "It'll be in the field come spring." Peterson's eyes narrowed. He was a man who had always mistaken patience for cowardice and thrift for a lack of ambition. "You and your damn antiques. Still got that old 2-cylinder your dad bought too. You're stuck in the past, Miller. This," he slapped the huge flat-spotted tire of the Steiger, "this is the future. I just got in a little ahead of the curve, that's all. The bank understands. We're already talking about restructuring, getting me into one of the new Case IH models next year." He was lying. We all knew it. The bank wasn't talking about anything but recouping their losses. The young loan officer who had been so eager to sign Peterson's papers 3 years ago was nowhere to be seen. Only the bank's senior vice president, a grim-faced man named Harrison, stood by the auctioneer, his arms crossed, his expression like stone. "You can't farm 1,000 acres with a damn 40-20. Peterson spat, his frustration boiling over. "You're a dinosaur, Miller. While you were out there tinkering with your grandpa's tractor, I was making money. Real money." I just looked at him, at the desperation behind the bravado. I thought about my own balance sheet, a simple ledger I kept in my desk drawer. The column for debt was empty. It had been for 6 years. I thought about the long nights I'd spent in my shop, the grease under my fingernails, the satisfaction of hearing an engine I'd rebuilt myself fire up for the first time. I didn't owe a dime to any man, and that was a feeling Richard Peterson, for all his talk of real money, would never understand. The auctioneer, getting desperate, dropped the price. 15,000. Do I hear 15? 10. Give me $10,000 for this machine, boys. Still, there was only silence. The Steiger was too big, too complicated, too thirsty for fuel, and too expensive to fix. It was a rich man's toy from a time of easy credit, and those times were gone. It would be sold for scrap, its value measured in pennies per pound. Peterson saw the pity and scorn on the faces of his neighbors, and his face turned a blotchy red. He turned and walked back to his truck, defeated. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever known a man like Richard Peterson? The kind of man who measures his worth not by the sweat on his brow or the grain in his bin, but by the shine on his new paint and the size of his monthly payment. The kind who confuses debt with progress. Let me know down in the comments, because it seems like every small town had one back then. And their stories, more often than not, ended right here, in a muddy field, with an auctioneer's chant hanging in the air like a funeral dirge. The story of how Richard Peterson ended up here, and how I managed to stay standing, didn't start on this cold November day. It started nearly a decade earlier, back in the spring of '73, the days of optimism, the days when the Secretary of Agriculture was telling us to plant fence row to fence row, and the price of corn was heading for the moon. Back then, Peterson was just another farmer, working the same 320 acres his father had. But he had an itch. He saw the big operators in the magazines, the guys with thousands of acres and fleets of brand new equipment. He wanted to be one of them. His first big move was trading in his reliable International 856 for a brand new 1466, the Red Power King. It was a beautiful machine, I'll give him that. Turbocharged diesel, a factory cab with air conditioning and a radio. It gleamed in the sun. He took out a big loan from the Production Credit Association to get it, and he paraded it around town like a trophy. I remember seeing him at the co-op that May. I was there picking up some seed bags, loading them into the back of my old Chevy C50 grain truck. My 4020 was parked out front. It was my main tillage tractor, the one my dad and I had saved for 3 years to buy used back in '71. It had the classic John Deere synchro range transmission, and I knew every gear and every lever by heart. That particular week, the power steering pump had started to whine, a sure sign the seals were going. Peterson pulled up in his 1466, the turbo whistling as he shut it down. He climbed out of the climate-controlled cab, looking fresh as a daisy. I, on the other hand, was covered in a fine layer of dust and grease. "Still running that old thing, Miller?" he'd called out, nodding at my Deere. "You know they make tractors with cabs now, keeps the dirt off you." "This one works just fine for me," I'd replied, heaving another bag into the truck. "Yeah, but for how long?" he said with a smirk. "I just plowed 100 acres yesterday and didn't even break a sweat." Listen to the ball game the whole time. You can't put a price on that kind of efficiency. The thing was, you could put a price on it. I knew exactly what his payments were because the young loan officer at the PCA couldn't help but brag about the big new loan he'd just written. It was more than my entire farm was worth at the time. That summer, while Peterson was plowing in air-conditioned comfort, my 4020's engine started showing its age. It was burning oil more than a quart a day, and the blow-by was getting bad. Come winter, I knew I had a choice. I could go to the bank like Peterson, use the rising land values as collateral, and trade up for something newer. Or I could fix what I had. I chose the shop. That December, after the harvest was in, I backed the 4020 into the machine shed, drained the fluids, and started tearing it down. It was a cold, lonely job. The cast iron of the engine block was like a block of ice, sucking the warmth right out of my fingers. I pulled the hood and the side panels, disconnected the fuel lines and the radiator hoses, and used my chain hoist, bolted to the main beam of the shed, to lift the heavy 6-cylinder engine out of the frame. I spent the next 2 months rebuilding that engine from the crankshaft up. I took the block and the head to a machine shop in town to have them magnafluxed for cracks and decked flat. I ordered a complete overhaul kit from the John Deere dealer. New pistons, sleeves, rings, bearings, gaskets, the works. I spent hours with a scraper and a wire brush, cleaning 20 years of caked-on grease and dirt from every surface. I measured the crankshaft journals with a micrometer, checking them against the specs in my technical manual until my eyes blurred. I remember one night in particular. It was late January, and a blizzard was howling outside, rattling the tin on the shed roof. The only light was a single bare bulb hanging from a cord, and the only heat came from a kerosene torpedo heater that roared in the corner, smelling of burnt fuel. I was torquing the main bearing caps, following the sequence in the book, feeling the satisfying stretch of the bolts as the wrench clicked at 90 foot-pounds. My hands were raw, my knuckles were busted, and I had grease ground so deep into my skin it wouldn't come out for a week. My wife, Sarah, came out, bundled in her winter coat, carrying a thermos of hot coffee. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching me. "You're going to freeze to death out here, Frank," she said softly. "Almost done for the night," I told her, wiping my hands on an already black rag. She looked at the disassembled engine, the hundreds of parts laid out in careful order on my workbench. "Richard Peterson just bought a new disc," she said, "a 24-foot International. They say he's going to rent the old Henderson place next year." I didn't say anything. I just poured a cup of coffee. The steam rose up in the cold air. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing?" she asked, her voice filled with a worry she tried to hide. "Everyone else is expanding, buying new. We're standing still." I took a sip of the hot coffee. It burned my tongue but warmed my chest. "We're not standing still, Sarah," I said, looking at the engine block. "We're building on a solid foundation. That 1466 of Peterson's, it belongs to the bank. This 4020, this one belongs to us. When I'm done, I'll know every single bolt in that engine. If it breaks down in the middle of planting, I'll know how to fix it. Peterson will have to call a dealer and wait for a mechanic who charges $40 an hour. There's a difference." She nodded, but I could still see the doubt in her eyes. The whole community was buzzing with the gospel of expansion and debt. Land prices were skyrocketing. If you weren't borrowing to buy more, you were a fool. You were being left behind. I was seen as the fool, the stubborn German farmer who was too scared to take a risk. The talk at the diner was all about Peterson's new disc. His plans to put up a new grain bin, the rumor that he was looking at buying another quarter section. And Frank Miller. Oh, he's out in his shed, tinkering with that old junk of his. By March, I had the engine back together. I painted it classic John Deere green, the paint thick and glossy under the single light bulb. Getting it lowered back into the frame was a nerve-wracking process. Inching it down with the chain hoist, lining up the motor mounts, making sure not to pinch a wire or a fuel line. Finally, after connecting everything, filling it with fresh oil and coolant, I climbed up into the seat. The vinyl was cracked and cold. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the new, tight engine over once, twice, and then it caught. It roared to life with a clean, crisp bark that was deeper and stronger than it had been in years. The blow-by was gone. The oil pressure shot right up to the green. I let it run for a minute, listening to the rhythm of the engine, the sound of my own two hands' work. It was the best sound in the world. The good years came, just like everyone said they would. From 73 on, commodity prices stayed high. We were feeding the world, they told us, and the money flowed. For men like Richard Peterson, it was a golden age. His big 1466 allowed him to farm more acres, faster. He did rent the Henderson place, and the year after that, he bought the 160 acres to the north of him. The bank was more than happy to lend him the money. Land was the best collateral you could have, they said. It only ever goes up in value. With every successful harvest, Peterson grew bolder. His talk at the co-op became less about farming and more about finance. He spoke of leverage, cash flow, and depreciation. He bought a brand new combine, an International 1460 axial flow, a revolutionary machine at the time. He put up 2 massive grain bins with a new leg and dryer system. His farmstead, once as modest as mine, started to look like a factory, a gleaming monument of steel and capital. And then, in 1979, he made his biggest move. He traded in the 1466 for the Steiger. It arrived on a flatbed truck, and it was like a spaceship had landed in our little corner of the world. Articulated steering, four-wheel drive, duals on all four corners, and that massive Cummins engine. It was a tractor built for the plains of Montana or the Dakotas, not our rolling Iowa hills. It was overkill, a machine born of ego. Peterson was no longer just farming, he was making a statement. He was the biggest, the most modern, the most successful farmer in the county. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. Those good years were good to me too. I had record yields, and with no debt payments to make, the money went straight into the bank. The temptation to expand was immense. Every day, it felt like I was falling further behind. When Peterson was driving his Steiger, I was still on my open station 40/20. In the summer, the sun beat down on me. In the spring, I'd get soaked by a sudden rain shower. In the fall, the dust would cake my face until I looked like a raccoon. People thought I was crazy. My own father-in-law sat me down at his kitchen table one Sunday. "Frank," he said, stirring his coffee, "you're a good farmer, a hard worker, but you're being too cautious. You're letting an opportunity pass you by. You could have that quarter section next to you. The bank would loan you the money in a heartbeat. You have to think about the future." "I am thinking about the future," I told him. "That's why I'm saving my money instead of spending it." He just shook his head, convinced I was a fool. What he didn't see, what nobody saw, was my discipline. I paid cash for a used John Deere 7000 planter, an 8-row model that was a big step up from my old 4-row. I found a good deal on a slightly used chisel plow that my 40/20 could handle. I upgraded my combine from an old John Deere 45 to a 6600, again paying cash. I wasn't standing still. I was improving, but I was doing it on my own terms, with my own money. Every evening, I'd sit at my desk and mark my expenses in my ledger. And every year, the number in the savings account grew. It was my war chest, my buffer against the unknown. I kept running the old iron because I knew it. I knew the sound the 40/20 made when it was running perfectly, and I could hear the slightest change that signaled trouble. I could rebuild the carburetor on my old Farmall M with my eyes closed. These machines weren't just assets, they were partners. They were simple, mechanical beings, and I understood their language. Peterson's Steiger, with its complex hydraulics and electronics, was a stranger to him. When it broke, he was helpless, a captain on a ship whose engine room was a complete mystery. The last truly good year was 1980. The harvest was bountiful, prices were still strong, and the optimism, though strained, was still there. I remember sitting on my porch with Sarah one warm September evening, watching the sun set over a field of corn that was ready to be picked. The air was cool and smelled of rich earth. In the distance, we could hear the low, powerful rumble of Peterson's Steiger. He was running late into the night, its bright halogen lights cutting across the horizon, a relentless machine chewing through the acres. It looked impressive. It looked like the future. His shadow, cast by the setting sun and the glow of his own progress, stretched for miles. It fell across my fields, across my modest house and my old machine shed. To anyone watching, he was the winner, and I was the man being left behind in the twilight. But as I sat there, I listened to a different sound, carried on the same breeze. It was the evening news report drifting from the kitchen radio. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking about something called the Volcker shock. He was talking about the Federal Reserve and its chairman, Paul Volcker, and their war on inflation. And he was talking about interest rates, prime rates, that were climbing, climbing, climbing. Past 15, past 18, on their way to 20%. The rumble of Peterson's Steiger suddenly sounded different to me. It no longer sounded like power, it sounded like a countdown. The countdown didn't take long. By the spring of 1981, the cracks began to show. The easy money had dried up, and the operating loans that farmers like Peterson lived on were suddenly being written at 18, 19% interest. Every bag of seed, every gallon of diesel, every drop of fertilizer was now financed at rates that would have been considered criminal just a few years earlier. The rumbling of Peterson's Steiger still echoed across the hills at planting time, but there was a frantic edge to it now. He was pushing the machine harder than ever, trying to outrun the numbers on the banker's ledger. I saw the first real sign of trouble in early June. I was cultivating my corn with my old Farmall M, a tractor my father had bought new in 1951. It was slow, tedious work, steering the narrow front tractor precisely between the tender green rows, the clatter of its two-cylinder engine, a familiar rhythm in the humid air. I looked across the fence line to Peterson's field. He was cultivating too, but with the Steiger pulling a massive 12-row cultivator at high speed. It was like watching a battleship try to navigate a canoe slalom. He was going too fast, and from my vantage point I could see him taking out whole sections of corn on the curves, the big machine too clumsy for the delicate work. It was a waste of good seed, and a sign of a man in a hurry, a man for whom precision had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Later that summer, the heat set in. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the rain simply stopped. The corn, which had looked so promising in June, began to curl its leaves during the day, a thirsty, desperate gesture. Day after day, we'd watch the clouds build up in the west, dark and promising, only to see them dissipate or pass us by, leaving behind nothing but a more oppressive humidity. My field suffered like everyone else's, but my costs were fixed and low. I knew I'd take a loss, but it would be a manageable one, covered by the savings I'd so carefully built. For Peterson, the drought was a catastrophe. He had borrowed against a 30-bushel per acre increase in yield that was now shriveling on the stalk. The breaking point for his machinery and for him came in August. The story came to me through the co-op grapevine. He was out dissing a field he'd rented, trying to get a jump on fall tillage, when the Steiger just stopped. 1 minute it was roaring across the field, pulling a 34-foot disc. The next, there was a sound like a grenade going off inside a metal barrel, followed by a grinding shriek and then silence. He climbed down from the cab to find a puddle of thick gear oil spreading from the underside of the tractor. The bull gear in the rear planetary final drive had shattered. It wasn't a simple fix. It wasn't something you could patch up in your own shop. The parts had to be special ordered from the factory in Fargo. A mechanic had to be dispatched from the dealership 60 miles away, a specialist who knew the guts of those big articulated machines. They brought a crane truck out to his field just to lift the massive tire and wheel off. The bill, just for the parts and labor, was over $7,000. That was more than I had paid for my 6600 combine. It was $7,000 that Richard Peterson did not have. The Steiger sat in his field for 3 weeks, a wounded green giant, a monument to an expense he couldn't cover, while the weeds grew up around its tires. That fall, the first cracks appeared in his empire. He was late paying his bill at the co-op. He sold off his small herd of feeder cattle early, at a loss, just to generate some cash flow. The gleam was gone from his equipment. A layer of dust and grime coated everything, the telltale sign of a man who no longer had the time or the heart for maintenance. The confident swagger was replaced by a haunted defensive look. When I saw him in town, he'd avoid my eyes, offering only a curt nod before hurrying away. He was a man being crushed under the weight of his own ambition, and the whole county was watching it happen. The whispers in the diner grew louder. The same men who had once spoken of his success with envy now spoke of his impending failure with a kind of grim, cautionary satisfaction. The winter of '81 was quiet and tense. The snow fell, covering the wounded land and giving us a temporary reprieve from our worries. But we all knew what was coming. The interest on those operating notes was compounding daily, a silent, relentless thief. Come spring, the banks would want their money. Spring of 1982 was the end. The prime rate, which governed Peterson's variable rate loans, had peaked at over 20%. The letters from the bank, which had started as polite reminders, became urgent demands. The young loan officer, who had once treated Peterson like a king, now refused to take his calls. Instead, he had to deal with the senior vice president, Mr. Harrison, a man who had seen booms and busts before and whose face was a mask of cold arithmetic. Corn prices had collapsed. A bushel of corn wouldn't even buy you a gallon of diesel fuel to plant the next one. The land that was supposed to be the ultimate collateral, the asset that only ever went up, had lost nearly a third of its value in 18 months. Peterson was trapped. He had borrowed against an inflated value that no longer existed. He had no equity, no cash, no way out. The bank called his notes, all of them. The foreclosure notice appeared in the legal section of the county newspaper, a small block of text that spelled out the death of a dream. A week later, a man from the sheriff's office tacked the official auction bill to the telephone pole at the end of his lane. It listed everything: the land, the house, the bins, the combines, the planters, the discs, and at the top of the list, the Steiger Panther III. The day of the auction was that cold, grey November morning. The crowd that gathered wasn't there to celebrate or to gloat. They were there as witnesses, as survivors. Every farmer standing in that muddy yard knew that it could have been them. Only a few twists of fate, a few different decisions, separated their own names from the one on the auction bill. I watched as Peterson's life was sold off, piece by piece. The International 1460 Combine, his pride and joy, went for half of what he owed on it. His tools, his grain truck, the very things he needed to make a living, were all sold to the highest bidder. And then came the Steiger. It sat there, silent and broken, its burst hydraulic line like a severed artery. Bill, the auctioneer, did his best, but he couldn't create a market that didn't exist. Nobody wanted a complex, expensive, broken-down giant in an economy where a reliable, paid-for 100-horsepower tractor was king. Mr. Harrison from the bank finally gave a curt nod, and the auctioneer announced, "Sold for scrap value to the salvage yard." The words hung in the air, a final, brutal epitaph. The symbol of the future, the machine that was supposed to guarantee success, was worth nothing more than its weight in melting steel. I survived because I had no debt. It was that simple. While Peterson was paying 20% interest to the bank, my only costs were my inputs. The drought hurt me, the low prices hurt me, but they didn't break me. My savings account, that war chest I had so patiently filled during the good years, acted as a buffer. I could pay for my seed and fuel with cash. My old 4020, with its rebuilt engine, started every time I turned the key. It sipped fuel compared to the Steiger's V8 thirst. When the hydraulic pump on my 6600 combine started to leak during harvest, I didn't have to call a dealer. I went to my shop, pulled out my technical manual, and rebuilt it myself on a Saturday night, using a kit that cost me $38. I lost 2 hours of harvest time, not 2 weeks. In the brutal economics of the 1980s farm crisis, that was the difference between sinking and swimming. My thrift, once seen as a weakness, had become my armor. After the auctioneer had sold the last of the small items, the crowd began to disperse, their collars turned up against the wind. Richard Peterson stood alone by his pickup truck, a man hollowed out, the bravado finally stripped away. Mr. Harrison, the banker, walked past me, his face grim. He paused and looked at me, then at my 4020 parked by the road. "Miller," he said, his voice low, "you were the smart one." There was no triumph in his words, only a weary acknowledgement of a hard truth. It wasn't the vindication I had ever wanted. I walked over to where Richard was standing. He didn't look up. He just stared at the muddy ground, at the tire tracks left by his neighbors as they drove away from the wreckage of his life. "Rich," I said quietly. He flinched, then looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Come to say you told me so, Frank?" he asked, his voice cracking. "No," I said. "I came to say I'm sorry this happened." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, it happened." He kicked at a clod of mud. "Don't know what I'm going to do. Sarah and the kids are moving in with her folks in town. I've got nothing. I don't even have a job." I took a breath. This was the moment that would define me, not as a farmer, but as a man. I could have walked away. I could have savored the victory. But looking at him, I didn't see a rival. I saw a neighbor. I saw a man who had dreamed big and fallen hard. "I could use a hand this winter," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "The engine on my old M is due for an overhaul, and I've got some welding that needs to be done on the grain truck box. I'll pay you a fair wage." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, a mixture of shock and shame and something else, maybe gratitude in his eyes. He, the man who had mocked my antiques, was now being offered a job to fix one. The irony was thick enough to taste. He swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. "Stop by tomorrow morning," I said, and then I turned and walked away. Richard Peterson worked for me that winter. It was awkward at first. He was quiet, humbled, but as we spent long hours in the cold of my machine shed, something changed. I showed him how I tore down the Farmall's engine, how I measured the cylinder wear, how I lapped the valves. He was a quick learner, and his hands, which had grown soft from years in a climate-controlled cab, slowly regained the feel of cold steel and greasy tools. We didn't talk much about the past. We talked about engine timing and torque specs. We talked about the weather. Slowly, a new kind of respect grew between us. He saw the care and knowledge I put into my machines, and I saw a man willing to work hard to put his life back together. At his land auction a few months later, I was there. The big investors and the insurance companies were there too, looking to pick up distressed land for cheap. The parcels were being sold off one by one. When the auctioneer came to the original Peterson Home 80, the place his grandfather had homesteaded, I stepped forward and started bidding. I got into a battle with a man in a suit from Des Moines, but I had my war chest and I wasn't going to lose. My final bid was higher than it should have been, but it was successful. I bought the Peterson home place. The next day, Richard came to my shop. "I heard what you did," he said. "Why, Frank?" "Because a man's history shouldn't be sold to a corporation," I said. "I'm going to farm it, and when your son is old enough, if he decides he wants to get into farming, the land will be here for him to rent. He'll have a place to start." Richard didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, turning his worn cap over and over in his hands. And for the first time since his world had fallen apart, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Life went on. The 1980s were lean years for everyone. But we survived. The community changed. The idea of a good farmer was redefined. It wasn't about the size of your tractor anymore, it was about the black ink in your ledger. My quiet, debt-free approach, once seen as eccentric, was now viewed with respect. Younger farmers would stop by my shop, not to talk about the latest models, but to ask how to rebuild a water pump or set the timing on an old diesel. The lessons of the crisis had been learned in the hardest way possible. Years passed. My son, David, grew up. He spent his summers in the shop with me, his hands becoming as greasy as mine. I taught him everything I knew. I taught him how to weld a straight bead, how to read a micrometer, how to listen to an engine and understand what it was telling him. But the most important lesson I taught him had nothing to do with mechanics. One afternoon in the late 80s, he was about 16, and we were out in the field, side by side. I was in the old 4020, pulling the chisel plow, and he was driving our newer, but still modest, John Deere 2950, a tractor we had bought with cash after a couple of good years. We stopped at the end of the field to take a break. He looked over at the 4020, its green paint faded by 20 years of sun, its engine humming a steady, reliable rhythm. "Dad," he asked, "why do we still keep this old thing? We could afford a bigger, newer one now." I shut the engine off, and the sudden silence was filled with the sound of the wind rustling the dry cornstalks. I looked out over my land. The fields were paid for, the house was paid for. The machines, from the ancient Farmall M to the 2950, were ours. "David," I said, pointing to the 4020, "that tractor represents a lesson. Back when everyone else was borrowing money to buy giants, this tractor taught me that freedom isn't about having the biggest and the best. Freedom is about not owing anything to anyone. That machine doesn't own us. We own it. We know its every secret. We can fix it with our own two hands. It will never be a weight that drags us to the bottom. It represents the foundation of everything we have." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the old tractor with new eyes. He was finally beginning to understand. "Now I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled with arthritis, and I don't spend as much time in the field. David runs the farm, and he runs it on the same principles. He's a good farmer, a smart businessman. He's expanded some, but cautiously, and always with cash. Richard Peterson's son now rents the old home place from us, and he's making a good start. Sometimes, on a quiet fall evening, I'll walk out to the machine shed. The 4020 is still in there. It's mostly retired, but David keeps it in perfect running order. He uses it to rake hay or pull wagons, a working piece of our history. I'll run my hand over its faded fender, the metal cool to the touch. I can still feel the ghosts of every season in that steel, the hot sun of summer, the cold bite of a winter overhaul, the hopeful dampness of spring planting. I think back to that grey morning at the auction, the smell of failure in the air, the sight of that dead Steiger in the mud. It was a giant, a monster of a machine built to conquer the earth. But in the end, it was the small, simple, honest things that endured. A rebuilt engine, a balanced ledger, a helping hand offered to a fallen neighbor. The giant was hauled away for scrap, its roar silenced forever. But the quiet, steady rhythm of the old iron, that sound, the sound of survival, can still be heard across these fields.